on the text that I address. If you simply type in my name and surname, a little dash, and in the name of whichever text you want to know about or want to be reminded of, some of my comments, Google takes up just about everything nowadays, as you know. So you will easily find the whole, because it has an archive. The African Library has an archive through LitNet. Okay, and there's my own email address, ahg@sun.ac.za, if you want to send me particular questions which you feel weren't addressed and which you would have liked to raise with me. Because unfortunately, because there's so much to address in terms of the 10 texts, there isn't really time in the hour available also to have questions. And then I wanted to say that we have in our midst a noted African writer, South African, long-time resident in Ghana, Manu Herbstein, who's sitting here in the front row on my right. Okay. Long time ago, I wrote an article for a book collection, and I called it Bookkeeping in Africa. And I used that as a kind of multi-layered image for what it is I think the best African writers do. And I thought of them as kind of holding to account the societies and particularly the leadership of the countries in which they find themselves. And I looked at other ways of reading this image, also at the need for us as Africans in particular, but for people all over the world, to keep and to treasure these books. And these books themselves are kind of archives, and together they form an archive of a great deal of African history and African knowledge. So, those are some of the ways in which I think about the kinds of African writing in which I'm interested. And I think that people often underestimate the extent to which novels are intellectual creations. They are creations, they are works of art, but they are intellectual in the nature of their achievement, in addition to being works of literary art. I'm reminded of that quotation from Hamlet when he speaks to the players, that he says, to show the very age and body of the time, his form and pressure. And I think that's what the best of these texts do. They're brilliant evocations of societies, and they use a fascinating mosaic of exemplars in the form of the different characters that they show interacting, to give us a dense and complex image of a society in their implicitly evaluative writing. I, of course, omitted a great many very important authors from the 2 sets of 10 writers that I addressed in yesterday's and today's lectures, including, for instance, our continent's 4 literary Nobel Prize winners. The first of them was Najib Mahfouz of Egypt. The second was Wole Soyinka. The third was Nadine Gordimer. And the fourth, James Coetzee, as I'm sure everyone knows. All right. But it seemed to me that in a course of this kind, I should bring to people's attention books of which they're less likely to be aware. Someone asked me, for instance, about Adichie. And I think that she, along with Achebe, she's one of the few writers that many of you here in the audience are likely to have encountered and or read. So I thought I want to broaden people's scope. I want to show them how much more is available and how fascinating it is. Today, for instance, when I addressed Loretta Ngobo to begin with, Loretta Ngobo's novel, And They Didn't Die. I address it because it is one of the few accounts of a rural black woman's existence under apartheid. That's Jezile, the main character in this novel. And it's a profoundly affecting, moving novel. It's harrowing reading in many ways, but it's a reminder of what apartheid was like and what it did and what it was like to live with it and under its terrible pressures. Now, there are many other novels that I could have brought in, but it seems to me important to bring in this kind of less-known novel. I've written 3 articles, I think, about Mungani Wale Serote's To Every Birth Its Blood. And, of course, internationally, people read the white writers. They read André Brink, they read Gordimer, they read Coetzee, and so on, about apartheid. And the black South African writers are much less known. And much less read. Okay, so I think it can also be interesting to compare this text with the one that I spoke about yesterday, I Speak to the Silent, because here we have people of the parental generation who were active in anti-apartheid ways, including Jezile, this main character, although she is a poor and not terribly well educated rural woman in KwaZulu-Natal. Okay, now what is fascinating about this text is the extent to which Nkobo, a woman of a similar background, although highly educated and in a leadership position, she portrays the double pressure under which Jezile lives, which is not only the apartheid laws and regulations, terribly restrictive as they are, but the restrictions of customary family life. And the main person with whom Jezile has to contend is her almost all-powerful, familiarly almost all-powerful mother-in-law, Mabiyele. And the first thing that she struggles with is her childlessness. And her husband is, of course, typically of the time, they live in a remote village. Her husband is a migrant laborer working in Durban. He comes home on his 2 weeks leave a year, so that's when a baby has to be conceived, if it is to happen. So, of course, she has a difficult time falling pregnant. Eventually decides that she's going to go to Durban. But this is at a time when she belongs to a group who have deliberately burnt their passes. Suddenly, she realizes that she's caught between these two fires. She goes and she gets the pass, she goes to join her husband, she does fall pregnant, and she also engages in the marches of the women of the time. This is a period of the great women's, preceding the Great Women's March, when the women burn beer halls and campaign not only against apartheid, but also against the ways in which their menfolk make themselves and their families, the ways in which they make their lives harder by alcohol consumption, by having other women, by being unfaithful, etc., etc. Okay, now I can't give you all the details of this, obviously, but it is absolutely convincingly portrayed from her own perspective. For instance, she gets jailed along with other women for demonstrating. She has a young baby at the time, and she's breastfeeding. So when the mother's in jail, because the husband has lost his job, and also for political participation, there's very little to feed this baby on. So this bonny baby that she was, when Jezile comes out of prison, is starving. And then the husband eventually resorts to stealing milk from Mr. Collett, the neighboring farmer, who refuses to sell them any milk because he says he needs it for his pigs. It's a kind of pattern of the time. Her husband is sent to jail for 10 years. And again, circumstances force her to take a job with a road gang nearby, led by a Mr. Potgieter. Mr. Potgieter is a Free Stater from Bloemfontein who asks her to come back with him to Bloemfontein to work there. The mother-in-law says, "We're not going to survive unless you do this. Leave your children with me," because by this time she's had a second baby. Gisile goes. It soon transpires that Potgieter is lusting after her, and he rapes her. He tells her he loves her, probably sincerely. I mean, this is the anguishing aspect of it. His married life is very unhappy, but Gisile is devastated. She cannot actually tell anyone. Her mother-in-law has already spread rumors about her. She cannot go back to her. She goes to her own mother. And her mother and the women of her mother's village understand. But eventually she has to rejoin her mother-in-law with the obviously white baby that she has born and that has got her sent back. So, Lungu is the white son that she has. Her daughters, if towards the end of the novel, one of them in particular becomes politically active. And towards the end of the novel, the sister of the political activist, when the police and soldiers are chasing her, Gisile finds a soldier about to rape her other daughter, who waited in the hut. And she stabs him to death, knowing that this will send her to, at the very least, a lifetime in jail. And it's only at this point, heartbreakingly, that her husband comes to find out from her. Actually, she goes to him. She says to him, "Why didn't you ever come see Yalu? Ever, ever?" Because he never returned to her. She says to him, "It's happened again," meaning that she links the rape that Potgieter did with the attempted rape of the soldier of her daughter. And she says, "I had to defend her. We have to defend ourselves." Her husband looks into her eyes, and the novel ends on his saying to her, "Gisile, life of my life." And this is, I think, the other heartbreaking aspect. Her husband loves her and has ever loved her. But custom and the refusal of allowing another man's child, let alone a white child, has forced him never to break custom by going back to her. Okay, this is the cover of And They Didn't Die, and now I'm turning to a novel by a Botswana author called Far and Beyond. The D is, omitted. And Unity Dow, the author, is a very fascinating woman. She was the first woman who served as a judge on the High Court of Botswana. And she fought very important cases for women's rights of inheritance and women's rights of conferring citizenship on their children if they were married to non-Botswana citizens. She's an internationally recognized jurist, although she has now resigned from the bench. She's also very active in working to assist AIDS sufferers, particularly in her own country and elsewhere as well. So the novel is written, I think, quite simply. It's meant to be accessible to readers at every level. What I want to emphasize is that a great deal of African writing, this is not superficially or obviously literary or very complex. It doesn't mean that it isn't a work of literary art and achievement. What the novel addresses in particular are the many levels of misogynism, of sexism, as we most usually term it, in her society. And the main character is Musa, which is brief for Musadi, which just means woman, but it also means she who keeps the home fire burning. Now that, of course, is in contradiction with far and beyond, because she has a favorite uncle who always told, his way of telling her that she would go far was not only that she would go far, but that she would go far and beyond. He's a lovable drunkard and quite a ne'er-do-well himself, but he had great faith in his niece's intelligence and aptitude. She goes through difficult times. Her two older brothers die of AIDS. Her mother breaks up with her best friend because her son Goma persuades her that it was the friend who bewitched her sons out of jealousy. Musa herself falls for the blandishments of when she's still in the penultimate year at school, falls pregnant, goes away and has an abortion and returns to school. And at school, there's a terrible sexually predatory practices of the teachers, the male teachers. They intimidate girls, they humiliate them, and of course, they seduce and rape schoolgirls. And Musa is determined to expose this. She forms a group, and they secretly write plays and poetry and create artworks, and they invite the Minister of Education, who happens to be a woman, to come to their year-end school prize giving. And to the dismay of the headmaster and the teachers, they perform these works of art on stage and in terms of their painting to alert the Minister of Education to taking action, which she promises to do, and hopefully, will do just that. But I'll read to you just one small extract, and this is Musa's mother, and it describes an evening when Musa herself is not at home. Mapule, and that's her mother, must have been asleep because it was a while before Stan, and he's Musa's younger brother, just a year younger, who was awake now, heard his mother fiddling with the door. He was expecting the door to creak open. But suddenly, with a vicious howl that made him sit up in bed, the man kicked the door in. This is a boyfriend, so to speak, of their mothers. Mapule screamed, and Stan felt his body stiffen with a sudden tension. Next, he heard repeated banging against the wall and knew without a doubt it was his mother's head hitting against the concrete wall like a cracking watermelon. I'll stop there. The boy runs and gets an axe. And he's horrified at his own capacity for violence, but he defends his mother by, hitting a big gash in this man's arm, the attacker, and of course rescuing his mother and taking her to hospital. But that's the way in which the society is structured. If a man impregnates a woman, all he needs to do is pay 4 cows and he can go off and have nothing further to do with the children. The marital ceremony seems to Musa, when she narrates it, she suddenly realizes, she says, it's actually an exercise in the humiliation of women, because the women are instructed that if your husband hits you, you keep it secret. And if your husband goes with other women, you don't talk about it. You put up with it. A man is allowed to do that. And the husband is instructed, if you hit your wife, just hit somewhere where it won't show and don't do it in public. Okay, that's the structure of society at this time. And it happens at many, many levels, as I've indicated. So this is what Unity Dao addresses. But what really strikes one about the text is not so much this kind of dreary information, which is not unfamiliar. We know that, you know, societies are rife with this kind of sexism in different manifestations. But it is the spirit of activism that Musa embraces and that the author endorses, because Musa refuses to accept that there is a situation ever that one cannot do anything against. And so she's always determined in her own feisty way to address things, to take steps. And one can see that, like her author, she is a young woman who will go far and beyond. I turn now to a poetically complex work of writing, and it is Yvonne Vera's The Stone Virgins. Vera is a Zimbabwean author, and she wrote, I think it's only 5 novels, 4 or 5 novels, of which is the last one that she completed. Her novels form something of a chronological sequence, and this one is set in the aftermath of the First Chimurenga. In other words, at the beginning of the post-colonial period, but of course, and this is what the text addresses, it's also the time of the terrible Matabeleland massacre. Many of you will be aware that in Zimbabwe the 2 leading groups are the Shonas, the Mashona, Shona-speaking people, and the Sindebele, who are of course related to the South African Zulus, and you know whose ancestors physically came from South Africa. They broke away from Shaka Zulu. All right. In the text, which is set in a small village, mainly set in a small village, the most interesting character to me, and the most arresting character, is a soldier turned criminal. His name is Sebasu. He is Ndebele, and in the aftermath of the institution of mainly Shona power, when Mugabe and ZANU-PF turned against the Ndebele group and branded them traitors and insurrectionists, he is a lone figure. It's not as though he is with others, but he is a man who is like a cornered wild animal. When I wrote an article focusing especially on this figure of Sebasu, I called it Reading the Stone Virgins as Vera's study of the catabolism of war. Now, you may not sort of remember what the word catabolism means. It means like decreation, uncreating. Because this is really what Vera is concerned with. Because Sebasu joins in the war as an idealistic and young man. He's 19 or so at the time. And remember, the war went on for nearly 1.5 decades. He's in the war until the end and beyond. And he realizes, you know, a bit like Harvest of Thorns, but in a much bitterer and more virulent way, how people like him, men like him, have been betrayed. And we first see him when he bursts on the scene in a horrifically detailed depiction of how he appears in the view of one of the younger of 2 sisters, as her older sister appears in view. Sebasu is behind her, holding her, and he slices off her sister's head. And then he proceeds to rape the younger sister. Now, it doesn't sound as though this is going to be anything but a picture of a monster. But what I find amazing about the achievement of this text is that Vera, who is known for being a feminist writer in her sympathies, in this text achieves what I call, I mean, it's a very clumsy term, but what she does is she de-others the perpetrator. Because even as she describes the rape, even in that very moment, this is absolutely amazing writing, she makes us understand the unassuaged yearnings of the man Sibaso, of everything he is deprived of. Love, family, having children, any kind of future. And it's all of that that he, in a sense, almost mimics or parodies in the very act of rape. So she makes you, even at the moment as you are, horrified by what is happening to the woman whose lips he ends off slicing to silence her before he leaves to kill himself. But she makes you have some form, despite yourself, some form of empathy, because she puts it into the writing and into the way in which she imagines him. He is contrasted with a good man who is a Shona, because, and I mention this because one critic has accused Vera of being, in a sense, almost pro-Ndebele in her text, but it's nothing of the kind. Her text is an anti-war text, and it's horrified at what war does to people and how it dehumanizes and malforms human beings who enter into these violent situations from the best and the noblest of motives, as Sibaso did, as we are shown. Okay, I'll leave the text at that. There's a lot more to the text. I just thought, it would be of interest if I concentrated on that aspect, which seems to me to be its most striking aspect. I turn now to a novel by a Senegalese author, and it's a novel that was written in French by Fatou Diom. I looked up again recently, and although this was her first novel, and I think she's a member of the Académie Française, she's a very highly rated author in French. But as far as I know, it's the only one of her novels that has been translated into English. My French just isn't good enough to tackle complex novels in French. But if yours is, you might read others of her text. But this is a fascinating novel because the narrator is a young woman from a small island off the more southern coast, well south of Dakar Island, a small island, and it mainly concerns that island community. It's called the belly of the Atlantic because there's an image of the Atlantic as a maw, a great gaping gulf that can swallow people. And so various instances of this. For instance, the legend is of a man branded as impotent, and he was so humiliated because a society that prides itself on honor. So humiliated was he that he walked into the Atlantic and drowned and was turned into a dolphin, and the legend has it that his wife walked after him and also turned into a dolphin. Okay, but then there later, as it were, reiterations of the story. The narrator is terrified, and this is why you have this image of a boy's legs and a soccer ball on the cover. All the youngsters on the island dream of becoming famous soccer players in France. And the teacher, who is the only person with a non-local surname on the island, except for the narrator, whose father was not an islander, and she's also an outsider because of that. The teacher warns them, and he tells them about a dear friend of his who was spotted by a talent scout, taken to France. He warns all the youngsters because he coaches the soccer team. the African soccer players are the migrant laborers of the soccer world. You're not going to make it. And you're misleading yourself if this is all you live to do and ought to achieve. So he's worried about them. And this friend of his went over and was soon ousted by jealous teammates and was soon arrested as an undocumented immigrant and ignominiously sent back, tried to survive for some years, his only friend a teacher, then rumors, oh, they're homosexual, so he too drowned himself in the Atlantic. Okay, the narrator loves one person apart from her younger brother very dearly, although she doesn't really, when she goes back to the island, feel at home there. This person that she loves most dearly is her grandmother. Because she was the daughter, the offspring of an outsider, her stepfather, who is a local, detested her, and when she was a baby, you know, she was in danger of being starved to death. So her grandmother rescues her and brings her up, and she adores this grandmother. I'll tell you something of how she describes this grandmother. Her grandmother always tells her, those with a good guide don't get lost in the jungle. And that's the role that her grandmother plays in her life. She says, the narrator says, my grandmother never ceased spinning the thread that bound me to life. And she, the narrator, calls her grandmother that female Gwelwar, and Gwelwar is a noble warrior, whose almond eyes opened a path for me through the shadows of tradition. Okay, so she lives in Strasbourg in France, and she's a moderately successful writer there, but she never describes anything of her immediate surroundings because she's nostalgic for the island from which she is, in a sense, now exiled. She cannot live there. She cannot live in the mean gossip of that society, where, when she returns, immediately hordes surround her who all want gifts. And that's all that they value her for, she feels. Okay, but she says of her writing, the author herself, that she has roots everywhere because, like the main character, the author is also resident in France and a long-time resident. And in the voice of the character, she says she has roots everywhere and she's at home where Africa and Europe put aside their pride and are content to join together in my writing, which is rich with the fusion they've bequeathed me. And I think this is what many of these authors who write in English, French, Portuguese, and other languages that are not their native tongues feel about their writing, that they do live in the world and that they do feel that they achieve some kind of fusion of the tongue that they use and its associations and the worlds and societies and personalities that they depict, which are predominantly African. I turn now to the first of two Nigerian women writers that feature in today's talk. Her name is Sefi Atta. And to me, she is, as it were, neck and neck with Adichie. You know, their output has followed a very similar pattern. Two first novels each, followed by a collection of short stories each, and so on. But Sefi Atta is much less well known than Adichie. In terms of Nigerian ethnicities, Adichie is, of course, Igbo, like Chinua Achebe, whereas Sefi Atta belongs to the Yoruba people of Western Nigeria predominantly. Everything Good Will Come is a kind of love story to Lagos. And Nigerians, most of them, seem to be, in a sense, a little bit obsessed with Lagos. I know that Cape Townians often resent the extent to which Joburgers say that, you know, it's Joburg that really matters and that really epitomizes this country. Anyway, for Nigerians, it's Lagos and Lagos only. Okay. I'll read out to you how I began the piece that I wrote for LitNet on this text. This brilliant, charming, and moving novel immerses the reader from the start in the sights, sounds, and smells of the teeming city of Lagos. The text functions like an unusual, subtle kind of Bildungsroman in which the personal, moral, intellectual, and political growth of the main character is a process of learning about the dimensions of life in the southwestern urban Nigerian environment and about the arduous process of finding and making a livable space for herself within it. Okay. Enitan belongs to a quite wealthy and privileged family. Her father, she's an only child. They live on Lagos Lagoon in a grand home. Her father is a Cambridge-educated barrister, but it's a very unhappy marriage and the parents are constantly at odds. The mother is embittered and the mother is also fanatically evangelical churchgoer, you know, in terms of the church group to which she belongs. And the child favors her father because he's much more easygoing. The mother is strict and rather grim. And so the child adheres much more to her father's presence in her life. She says to us about her situation at school, "You were teased for being yellow," that means light-skinned, or fat for being Muslim, or for being dumb, for stuttering, or wearing a bra, and for being Ibu, because it meant you were Biafran, or knew people who were. So that gives you a sense of the time setting. Not that the Biafran War plays any kind of prominent role in the text, but the references to being yellow refers to girls, schoolgirls, prepubescent schoolgirls who have a white parent. And then the other no is being Muslim. Next door to is Enitan moves in a girl whose mother was British, and she comes to live with two Muslim stepmothers. Her father, who is a sheikh, they are his second and third wives. And this girl is the typical wild girl, and Enitan is the typical goody two-shoes, but of course she falls under the irresistible influence of this flamboyant girl who is now her neighbor. They're both 11 at the time. And Sherry, her full name is Sheritan, she wears lipstick and Cresson d'Or perfume. There's of course Christian Dior. Anyway, she invites Enitan along to a party, but the wild boys at the party not only get seriously drunk, they also smoke hashish, and they proceed when Enitan is elsewhere because she's shy, she kind of hides away. They rape her friend. She's bleeding, humiliated, terrified, and of course she had got herself drunk too. So that's the end of the friendship in the parents' views. Sherry tries to self-abort, ends up sterile, and Enitan is packed away to Britain, first to high school and then for legal studies to follow in her father's footsteps. But after some years, she's sick of what she calls the muffled racism of the British firm and returns to Nigeria and reunites with Sherry. Sherry, who has taken on as a lover a Muslim brigadier. So she's a bit horrified because she's become terribly conscious of the sexism of her society, of the fact that her own father secretly has a second family, that he was unfaithful to his wife and reproached her for neglecting her appearance when the little brother in the family was dying of sickle cell sorry, what's the term again? Anemia. Yeah, I had ammonia in my mind and I knew it was wrong. Anyway, anemia. So she turns towards her mother. She contracts a marriage, but her husband expects her to be the traditional sort of wife. And she, however, begins to be something of a political activist in her society, particularly in terms of the kinds of sexism that manifests itself, apart from the more straightforward forms of repression. And her husband forbids her. So she defies him, especially because her father is arrested for defending a client who is defying the powers that be. And she gets herself, she's pregnant at the time, gets herself arrested that one night in a women's prison, where she meets stinking, foul-mouthed, horrible-seeming women. Is the great education. It's right at the end of the novel, but it's perhaps the greatest social education about her own society that she undergoes. And she learns from these women why and how they got themselves, not got themselves, but how it came about that they were jailed, and why many of them feel that they will never get out of there, which she does, of course, after a single night. Anyway, in the end, she gets her father free, and she's so delighted at the news that she dances in the street, and she celebrates, saying, "Everything good will come," and she dances in the rain. Okay, and it's on that note that the text ends. All right, I'd better move things along because I see there's not much time. Beneath the Lion's Gaze by Musa Mengiste is set in Ethiopia, and it's mainly the story of a family. It's a middle-class family of Christian. I mean, some are a bit secularized. The main characters are the father in the family, who's a doctor, and his younger son, who is a political activist. And this is the period when first Emperor Haile Selassie is overthrown, and this is followed by the military regime of the Derg, which means committee, led by Mengistu. Of course, ironically, his surname, as we use it in the Western sense, is very similar to Musa Mengiste, the author's second name. Okay. And it's a story of how the father disapproves of the son's activism because he thinks he stands no chance. But the son persists. The father is, in fact, the one who ends up jailed because he sought to save the life of a grievously tortured young woman by giving her a cyanide capsule because he didn't want her to be returned to her captors for further torture. And this is discovered. He is jailed and he is tortured terribly, and it's evoked in great detail. And eventually emerges a broken man. So it's a picture, an evocation of a truly terrible time. One incident describes a little boy of 8 who is tortured by the police, who identify him as the youngest of our enemies. And the author, Mengiste, says that she felt vindicated about describing something so horrible as the torture of a little a young boy, when after writing the novel, she, in a museum showing photographs of the victims of the so-called revolution, she saw many pictures of young boys, many of whom could have been the same little boy that she showed. So she felt that, anguishing and difficult as it is for authors like herself to depict this kind of dreadful event, they owe it as an act of commemoration to those who are harmed and destroyed by the evils of evil governments in many of the countries of our continent. Little Mother is the term in Somali culture. The author is Christina Ali Farah. She's not related to Nuruddin Farah. It's a very common last name amongst Somalis. And it's a novel of the Somali diaspora. It was first written as Madre Piccola, of course in Italian, and very brilliantly translated. And there's three main characters, two of whom are cousins who grow up as close as sisters. And they are ousted from Somalia when Somalia collapses at the time of the overthrow of Siad Barre. Both cousins' fathers were activists, and both die because of the repression that they stand up against. They both end up in Italy. There's another character, and he is an example of how much more badly male Somalis cope with the conditions of exile than the women. This is something that is confirmed by Nuruddin Farah also. Because in Somalia, the society they grow up in empowers them in so many ways, and they served hand and foot and so on. So the women end up much more adaptable. When they end up in different countries, they make do. They start to find jobs and they manage their lives. It's a deeply moving novel. These three voices are intertwined, and they each get speaking turns, and they give us a composite picture. But the novel begins with the voice of one of the three main characters, who is Somali Italian, because her mother's Italian. And she begins, although she's proud of her dual culture, she begins by citing a Somali poet, Somali Ben Ahai, which means I am Somali. So she proclaims that with pride. I wanted to glance quickly at one example of a magical realist type text, because although it combines passages of ordinary realism with magical realism, it's a futuristic text. It's again set in Lagos, and the main character is an oceanographer, a woman, and she finds out suddenly that she has special powers. When her husband forbids her to go to a music concert, she suddenly finds that she can freeze him just as he's beginning to assault her. She makes a gesture and he freezes, which of course convinces him that she's a marine witch, which is supposedly the worst kind, because he's become a fundamentalist Christian. And of course there is a great deal of what one might call almost fanatical Christianity, alongside the Muslim extremism, which is much better known and much more notorious, but it's just as bad and just as narrow-minded. Extremism is extremism, whatever the faith. Anyway, this main event in the story is the arrival of aliens, well-meaning aliens, who land their great spaceship in Lagos Lagoon. Why? Because they've selected Nigeria. The author tells us that the reason she wrote the novel as she did is because she'd seen District 9, the film that most of you, I think, will know about. And she said it made her a bit angry about the way in which, as you know, Nigerians are portrayed as the smugglers and the criminals and the exploiters. Now, the novel doesn't spare Nigerians as, hustlers, opportunists, and so on, but it also shows the many brilliant people, and in fact, as it were, endorses Nigerianness by the very fact that the aliens chose Nigeria, and specifically Lagos, as the place where they wanted to settle, which they do end up doing after all kinds of troubles and issues. And it's, the novel is extremely entertaining, but it's also fascinating, and it is, again, in its own way, a kind of social assessment with its own political strength, looking at the weaknesses of the society and responding to them, but also endorsing its strengths and applauding implicitly the achievements and the courage of the admirable characters. Finally, Yvonne Adiamba Ogbuo's novel, Dust. It's a major novel. It took her reportedly 10 years to write. It's a highly complex novel, and it's probably quite difficult for most non-Kenyans to get into. She quotes from many Kenyan languages in phrases that, I'm in the lucky position of having had Kenyan colleagues to ask for translations. But also because of the multiple allusions to Kenyan history, because she covers 50 years of Kenyan history in the novel. And it's deployed, not chronologically. The main focus is on a family that live in the far north of the country, which is Turkana territory. Although the main male character, who is an elderly gentleman called Nyepir, this is how his daughter sees him. He has a son who's just been killed, and his daughter arrives at the airport from South America. She's an artist, and this is how she sees her father. He's been a police officer, but no longer is. He's now a farmer and an international trader. Actually, he's a gun smuggler. Her father, Aggrey Nyepir Uganda, is a slender, dark stone statue in front of her. Only his eyes roam spaces, taking everything in, the emptiness too. Eyes reddened and popping out, shadowy tear streaks on an ebony face, his old policeman posture intact, straight, stiff, steady. He is old world dapper in a slightly shabby 1970s coat and 1950s brown leather fedora, tinged with the grey of age. Clandestine wrinkles congregate at the corners of his eyes. As with so many men of Kenya from his time, his manner is genteel English colonial, stranded in time's paradoxes. It's a fascinating character, but the novel reveals slowly the terrible secrets in his own past, because Kenya's history is a bitter and terrible one. My former colleague, Dr. Grace Musila, has referred in her own study of an event in Kenya. She heads one of her chapters, the assassin state, because it's a history of assassinations covered up in Kenya. The one that stands out in this novel, because the assassinated leader was a hero of Nyepir, was the fellow Luo, Tom Mboya. Many of you may remember the horror in Kenya. It was, you might say, the equivalent of someone like Biko in our country. And Tom and Boya